So our next speaker is Dr. Jan Dekkers from Newcastle University. He works on bioethics at that institution, and his work revolves mainly around animal ethics, reproductive ethics, and embryo research in the ethics of genetics. And he's the author of the book Animal Liberation: Should the Consumption of Animal Products Be Banned? He'll be talking today on the subject, is veganism morally required to protect global health? I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Dekkers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, James. Thank you to the Center for Animals and Social Justice. Thank you to the Schweitzer Institute for hosting this conference and for inviting me to speak on a theme that is very close to my heart. So what I would like to explore in this session is whether veganism is required to protect global health. I define veganism, first of all, as the practice of avoiding the consumption of animals and of products derived from animals' bodies. And I define moral veganism as the theory that one ought to avoid the consumption of animal products and of products derived from animal bodies. So I'll start by sketching a little bit of context. I think it's important when we talk about veganism that we recognize that many people use animals for food, and that this is a lifeline for many people who live in areas where arable crops are hard to cultivate, and perhaps increasingly hard to cultivate in light of the challenges that we have ahead of us, and the challenges that have already, of course, kicked into action with the crises that Robin has laid out for us. And in areas where land can support grazing or browsing, right? Because grass, as well as other plants that non-human animals can eat and digest, can sometimes grow in places where it is not possible to grow animal crops for direct human consumption. However, I think there are also sound reasons to question the human consumption of animal products. My starting assumption is my moral theory, which says that we should always aim to promote the greatest positive global health impact in all our actions. We've talked about welfare today. We have talked about benefits. I think when we talk about welfare and benefits, we can also talk about health. You might use a mnemonic device, global health impact, GHI. I think we should keep that firmly in our focus. So what does that entail for the consumption of animal products? How can we ensure that our diets fulfill this duty to promote global health impact? When does consuming animal products promote the greatest positive global health impact? And when does it fail to promote greatest positive global health impact? So why might the consumption of animal products fail to maximize positive global health impact? Well, one fairly obvious situation, not so obvious to many philosophers, unfortunately, because many people do not consider death as a harm, right? Animal welfareists, you might call them, at least some of them. But ordinary people would often consider death to be not a healthy situation to be in, right? And I think this is no different for non-human animals. When they are dead, they are no longer healthy. And the consumption of animal products is frequently preceded by the human infliction of death upon the animals who are being consumed. Now, even in situations where people do not actually eat the bodies of animals, they may eat products derived from them, for example, milk products and eggs, where their production is associated with practices that result in animal deaths. For example, in the dairy industry, many calves are killed at birth, right? The reason why they are killed at birth is because they are not the right breed to be kept for their meat, right? So dairy farmers consider them to be surplus to requirements. And in fact, this is not just a case for male calves, but also for some female calves when they are surplus to requirements. So they get born and they get killed, right? The British Cattle Breeders Club recognizes this, amongst many others that recognize this. And they write, and I've just checked their website, about 7% of farms, presumably that it means in the UK, reached averages of 5 lactations or more. And here they're not talking about the deaths inflicted upon calves, but the deaths inflicted upon the cows who are kept in the dairy industry. So cows will last up to 6-7 years, 5 lactations, and then their lives will be terminated because the economic calculus no longer adds up. As the cow gets older, the productivity will start going down. So it does not make sense to have the cow impregnated again. It is more economically efficient to replace the cow by a heifer that then becomes a new dairy cow used for milk. They also recognize that the natural lifespan of cattle is said to be approximately 20 years. I don't know whether that is the case, but in any case, that is significantly longer than the average lifespan of cows in the dairy industry. So those are killed as well when they are no longer economically productive. In the egg industry, farmers typically kill roosters as soon as they hatch. Because again, they're the wrong breed to be kept for their meat. Yeah. So here you see male chicks who have just hatched and they go into a macerator, which is the way in which they are disposed of. And the Humane League of the UK, for example, writes that layer hens live to about 18 to 24 months old before being sent for slaughter. And again, that's the same argument, right? The reason why they have to be sent for slaughter is because economically it's no longer in the interest of the farmer to keep these hens. It is cheaper to replace them by the next generation of hens, right? So they're all being sent for slaughter at the same time, in spite of the fact that it could go on to live for quite a few more years. So that's one reason why the consumption of animal products does not promote health, the killing of these animals. But of course, in the process of being killed and of being kept and reared, the animals are made to suffer significant pain. Right? And this is, of course, something that many people will consider to be a very significant moral issue. And I'm also at one with them. Animals are often kept in high densities, which increases risks of stress and disease. So the typical way in which they are being treated is by large amounts of antibiotics being used, which gives all sorts of other problems that do not relate to the infliction of pain and harm upon these animals, but of course creates problems for human health, which I'll come to in a moment. And sometimes we inflict we inflict pain on animals even before they are being conceived, right? You might say, how is that possible? How can we inflict pain on an animal even before they're being conceived? And we've already heard Dan speak about this theme earlier on today, when he mentioned the fact that some breeds have been genetically programmed to be unhealthy, essentially, right? They can be reasonably healthy up to the time that they are ordinarily slaughtered, but if you allow them to live any longer, they create all sorts of problems. They get all sorts of problems. And this is a problem in the meat chickens that Dan mentioned this morning, where the breeding stock needs to be kept almost to starvation, because otherwise they could not reach the age of sexual maturity, right? But there are other examples as well. If you look at the Belgian blue breed of beef cattle, they have a double muscling genetic trait. Now, this genetic trait is something that happened spontaneously, that wasn't actually sort of bred into them, if you like. But the reason why this is now the dominant trait is because people have artificially selected these animals so that now, by and large, the beef breeds will have this trait. The problem with that is that the animals have difficulty giving birth. Many of them require cesarean sections. And of course, many of these experiences are not very pleasant for the animals. I'm sure a veterinarian could give you a more elaborate theory of the sorts of problems that animals get when these animals have, well, not quite double the amount of muscle that they would ordinarily have, but in any case, many more muscles and much bigger muscles than they would have had if they hadn't had this genetic predisposition. Another example is the dominant breed of chickens used in the laying industry, where they lay significantly heavier, bigger, and much larger number of eggs compared to the chicken from which they have descended, right? So problems include a whole raft of things: cloacal prolapse, egg yolk, peritonitis, egg binding, impacted oviduct, neoplasia, ovarian cancers, stress, as well as aggressive behavior related to stress. So, not so good either, right? But then we need to consider the negative impacts upon human health as well, for various reasons. And I mentioned 4 negative impacts upon human health associated with the consumption of animal products. First of all, we kill animals, right, on a massive scale. And many people associate negative experiences with slaughterhouse work. And I call them negative health experiences, right? Funnily enough, many universities do not pride themselves for having degrees in turning students into slaughtermen. And so the word slaughtermen is probably appropriate because by and large, men who might be doing this work, I suspect. So this is an image of Eddie from the film Slaughterhouse, The Task of Blood, which interviews a number of slaughterhouse workers in a slaughterhouse in Oldham. And Eddie is about to kill a cow here, right? He actually says happy birthday to the cow when he kills the cow. Is this a way in which he tries to overcome his feelings of negativity with what he's doing, to make it sort of somehow feel better for him? I don't know. But it's probably something out of which most people do not get a lot of pleasure. It's not particularly healthy in that sort of sense. There's also, of course, illnesses that we can and we are more likely to obtain through consuming some animal products. For example, salmonella, E. coli, diverticular disease, right? Those are diseases that primarily impact those who consume animal products. Of course, they can also sometimes affect others because there might be lettuce, for example, and other vegetables and so forth as being infected with salmonella as a result of people touching animal products first and then touching vegetables and so forth, right? Of course, COVID-19 is still fresh in our minds, and the jury is still out as exactly what the causal connection is between the way in which we relate to animals and the consumption of animal products. That's being used for human consumption. Are they implicated in it? I'm not an expert again, but they might have been implicated. In any case, it's a zoonotic disease, and about 3/4 of diseases that have emerged in the last 50 years are zoonoses, which are diseases that are transmitted from non-human to human animals. I also mentioned non-Hodgkin lymphoma. You might be surprised to see this. There are some people in the United States of America who've successfully taken Monsanto to court for contracting non-Hodgkin lymphoma. because they have been exposed to high levels of glyphosate. And some courts in the United States have agreed with the claimant that glyphosate might be implicated in the development of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Now, of course, glyphosate is also something that is being used outside the animal industry because it is part of a very commonly, the most widely used weed killer that is used in the world, right? I won't mention the name, perhaps. Good. If you eat vegetables, the chances are that your vegetables will also have been sprayed with a weed killer. But the point is that the reason why the consumption of animal products is more implicated is because about a third of all animal crops that are grown not for human consumption, but are grown to feed non-human animals. Apart from that, glyphosate is also used on some plants that are grown specifically to feed farm animals. Okay, then another reason why human health is in jeopardy is because of the indirect health impacts related to the use and abuse of resources. And I split them up between land, water, and air, okay, for sort of analytical purposes. But of course, some of these, they're not neatly separated, land, water, and air, right? When we talk about land, first of all, about 75% of all agricultural land is being used to produce animal products, right? So that includes grassland as well as arable land that is used to grow crops that are then fed to farm animals. Another problem is phosphate rock. So phosphate rock comes from very few countries. We've run out of guano, right? Which used to be a significant source of phosphate. In order to continue to use phosphate, we need to mine phosphate, right? And this is a dwindling resource. Some people talk about peak phosphate. A lot of phosphate rock is turned into fertilizers, spread on the land, ends up in the rivers and eventually into the seas. And we haven't as yet found a good way in which we could possibly reclaim it from the sea once phosphate has washed off the land. So the green and pleasant land. Or a grass monoculture. Yeah? Of course, this is not a natural land in the sense that, we probably would see a much greater diversity of species on the land if we hadn't developed it specifically for sheep grazing. George Monbiot talks about the land being sheep-wrecked. I find quite an interesting concept. Sheep-wrecked land. Of course, sheep also graze very close to the roots of the plants, which means that the land is more prone to erosion, which is another problem, land degradation. That's actually in Derbyshire, that picture. But you can see that there are many places across the UK. Then there's water. Many diets that include animal products use slightly more water compared to other diets. Some people have overstated the difference in the past. Bruckner, I think, has done a good job in suggesting that it's only a slight difference. However, we shouldn't just think about the amount of the amount of water that's being used to grow crops. We should also think about what we actually do to the water by consuming animal products. If we consider the impact of human diets on the water sources, we need to consider dead zones. Now, dead zones often happen in places where there's a high concentration of animal products being consumed and particularly being produced, right? So the Mississippi Delta, classic example, but there are many other examples, the River Wye in Wales and so forth. There's many dead zones in that river. Essentially, what happens is that a lot of the manure and fertilizers run off the land or they spill over into the waterways. They result in a massive increase in the algae. When the algae die, it results in hypoxia and it kills the life in the river because it takes the oxygen out of the river. Okay. We also have water pollution from the release of nitrates in manure and fertilizers, as well as from the use of antibiotics, detergents, disinfectants, and antiparasitic agents. And we also need to consider the impacts of fishing. Often when we talk about the farming of animals, we forget about the fishing industry. About half of fish who are currently being caught come from aquaculture systems, but the remaining half, it comes from wild fishing from the oceans primarily, where a lot of the fish is actually quite a significant amount of the fish that's being caught is not caught to feed human beings directly, but used to feed for animal feed. And bottom trawling in particular is something that's worth considering. I do not have the figure for how much ecosystem damage has been caused by bottom trawling, but it is very, very significant. And you can see the impact of bottom trawling here. On the left, you see an untrawled seamount, and on the right, you see a trawled seamount. So essentially, the trawling is a net being dragged across the bottom of the seafloor and sweeping up not just the animals that live there, but also the plants that populate the seafloor and so forth, right? Resulting in a barren desert, if you like, at the bottom of the sea. Then there's the air. Agriculture may account for almost a quarter of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Again, there's different figures for different studies. The majority come from animal products, right? That's a very significant thing. Why? Because of carbon dioxide, where the Haber-Bosch process is very significant. So the Haber-Bosch process has allowed us to fix nitrogen from the air into a nitrogen pellet, which is then spread onto the fields. And essentially, in order to fix nitrogen from the air, you need a lot of energy. That energy has traditionally been supplied by the burning of fossil fuels, particularly gas, right? So I think there's a factory just outside Liverpool that produces fertilizers through the Haber-Bosch process, and that produces just about the same amount of emissions of the whole city of Liverpool. Of course, these fertilizers are not just used to grow plants that are consumed by animals, but precisely because the resource is so inefficient, those people who consume animal products contribute relatively more to the problem caused by the overuse of the overproduction of carbon dioxide through nitrogen fixation. Then there's methane, mainly from enteric fermentation inside the digestive systems of ruminants, right? So the belching and so forth of the cows in the field and so forth produces methane, another powerful greenhouse gas. And then there is nitrous oxide, again from manure as well as from fertilizers, essentially where the nitrogen combines with oxygen to go up in the atmosphere, and that's a powerful, very powerful greenhouse gas, much more powerful than carbon dioxide. Now, this perhaps wouldn't be so bad if this graph didn't exist, right? So I think this is quite an interesting graph because I would be interested to compare this graph with the graph of biodiversity loss that we have had. There probably is a very strong correlation, but this is a graph of the world population going from 10,000 before the Common Era to a projection to 2030, right? You can hardly see the line going from 10,000 BCE up to about 4,000 BCE. You can just about see it when it's 2000 BCE, and then around 1800, and particularly around 1900, it goes off the scale. We are now almost at 9 billion people on the planet, right? In other words, if we want to have any chance to save biodiversity, we need to eat low down on the food chain. We cannot continue to produce as many and as much waste and to produce and to use as many resources as we are currently using.
Jan, just a quick question. Can you just
Sure. Yeah.
I think everyone will be wondering this. So what's the date there?
Oh.
Where it really
Yeah.
goes up, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's just.
What's the date?
Unfortunately, the
What
only
year?
the only way I could get it in, the only way I could get it in is by having 0 to 2030.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't get any more.
So you don't know what year that is then?
No,
That
no,
should be after World War II, right around.
no,
When
no.
this really, we first hit the first first 2 billion.
I tried actually. I tried to get more detail here at the end.
Mm,
Yeah, but unfortunately, then I would lose this bit
yeah.
in order to get it into one graph. If you go on the website of Our World in Data, this is actually an interactive graph. So you can go back and forth to get more detail about any range of data.
I mean, I'm guessing it's probably 1800.
Yeah, 80 around
Industrial
1800,
revolution,
but
yeah.
particularly sort of 1900. 1900 it goes. Yeah,
I think it's much later actually. It's
The
after
first-
Second World War.
Is that right?
The
Yeah.
first billion, I don't know, but 2 billion was in the 50s.
in any case, it really hit me actually when I saw this. I mean, of course, I've been aware that we have a rising population, but I've been aware of this for a very long time. But then you look at this and you think, what? Right? And that's why I've shared it with you.
Somebody has commented that the world population was half of what it is now in 2005.
All right.
Katrina commented.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Katrina. People's mental health may also be undermined, right? Now, of course, many people might not like the idea of killing animals so much, as I mentioned before, but even where animals are not being killed, the question I'm asking myself is, yes, we have been biologically programmed to have some sort of appetite for eating animal products because we are omnivores. But do we also have some discomfort associated with the sheer act of consuming animals and perhaps with the sheer act of consuming animal products, not just animals, also milk, eggs, and so forth? And I've grappled with this question for a number of years, and I still think I haven't quite resolved it.
There an editing mistake where it says other human beings. Should that be other animals?
No,
Oh, right, sorry.
it's not a mistake.
Okay.
No, but I want to start from this. I think many of us might agree that we do not feel the idea of eating another human being is a comfortable one, right? Yeah? Even after we don't have to kill them, they can die naturally, right? Now, my question is this just a cultural preference? In which case you might say, well, what's the moral relevance? Or is this actually deeply embedded within human nature, this kind of discomfort? And if it is deeply embedded within human nature, then perhaps it's a moral universal, you might say. We should perhaps think seriously about this and say, look, even if we don't have to kill the animals, we still have some sort of discomfort associated with eating animal products. Now, of course, I don't have a discomfort with eating breast milk, right? And many of you probably will agree. We've been also biologically programmed to like consuming human breast milk, right? But the idea of eating a human being is perhaps a little bit more uncomfortable. So the question is, do we have the discomfort also when we consider eating the milk from another animal, right? Or is that actually equally attractive as you drinking human breast milk, right? Or is it more like the idea of eating another human being? Right. The vegan barbecue. It's a thought experiment that I developed in this book, which is a more elaborate exposition of what I've been talking about today. Vegan barbecue is the idea. You've got a bunch of vegans who are on their way to their allotment where they're going to harvest some vegetables and they're going to eat those vegetables. But on the way to the allotment, they suddenly find a deer has been run over by the car in front of them. And they changed plans. They say, look, we don't want to disrupt the vegetables that are growing in the allotment. We will leave them for another day, because if we disrupt those vegetables, we might also kill rainworms and so forth that live in the soil as well as other insects. We're going to have a barbecue instead. We're going to eat the deer because the deer has just been run over, right? Now, some vegans might actually quite like the prospect because they say this is free meat, right? We're not doing any harm, at least according to the conventional animal ethics theories, which say the harm lies in killing an animal or inflicting pain or suffering on the animal. But as long as those are out of the way, you can do what you like, right? Now, I don't associate myself with that mainstream kind of argument because I still have the discomfort. I don't want to eat the deer. I don't want to eat it. Why? Cannibalism, right? Let's come to cannibalism. So the idea of eating other human beings, you could say, well, that's a cultural preference because we also have cannibalists, right? Cannibalistic cultures. Endocannibalism refers to eating human beings from your own group. And I've recently been studying the case of the Wari, I hope I pronounced their name correctly, or the Paca Nova of Western Brazil. The question I'm asking, is there discomfort there? If there is no discomfort, then perhaps there's nothing wrong with the idea of eating another animal, including a human animal. But if there is a discomfort, even amongst the Wari, then perhaps we can say this is a universal principle. We might have a certain appetite towards eating animal products, but we also have some sort of discomfort and disgust associated with it. So even amongst the Wari, close relatives, interestingly, abstain. They do not participate in the ritual eating of the dead body. Okay? Maybe because they kind of see this idea of eating a close relative as somehow incompatible with showing respect for the body of the close relative. And they also associate discomfort with dismembering. And of course, as we all know, in many situations, eating a non-human animal also is preceded by dismembering the animal. So perhaps if we have a discomfort, including the Wari, about dismembering an animal, then since dismembering precedes the eating of the non-human animal, we might perhaps have a similar kind of discomfort associated with dismembering and eating the animal that has been dismembered. Right. So this is work in progress. This is to some extent addressed in that book, but not in great detail. The cannibalism is sort of a new angle. And I'm interested to see your thoughts on that. That's the question. Yeah. Many people would not dream of eating their own pets as well, right? Perhaps useful to draw into the equation as well. So, well, actually, but your pet had a good life and died a natural death, or was accidentally run over by a car, perhaps, right? Why not eat that rabbit? Why would you eat other rabbits? Yeah, that sort of thing. Okay. So in light of all that, one might be tempted to conclude that vegan diets should be preferred. And George Monbiot claims that the universal adoption of a vegan diet could reduce the amount of land that we use for farming by 76%. Just imagine what we could achieve if he is correct. If we could use the amount of land that we currently use for farming by that much. Of course, chances are the land might then be taken up by other activities that do not promote wildlife, non-human animals either, right? So it's not necessarily guaranteed, but at least it creates a possibility of doing something different with that land that is not using it for human use. Because I think we have a strong interest in leaving land alone for non-human biodiversity, because we cannot continue to eradicate non-human biodiversity at the rate that we have been doing, as has been set out by Robin in his earlier talk, right? 1,000 times faster than, or at least 1,000 times faster than you ordinarily expect. And Willett et al. Estimate that the universal adoption of vegan diets could reduce agricultural emissions by 80%. Right, so that's also a very significant reduction. And again, the question is whether this figure is correct, but in any case, I think there's very little disagreement that we could significantly reduce agricultural emissions by adopting vegan diets. So, should we then come to this conclusion? You might say, not too hasty, not too fast, because many animal products tend to have a wider range and a greater quantity of amino acids that might be perhaps difficult for some people to get through other means, as well as some substances that are not present in many other foods, for example, vitamin B12, right? So if people are not able to get vitamin B12, as well as all the amino acids that are required for us to maintain good health, you might say perhaps they have a good argument for continuing to use non-human animals. People who consume animal products that have been produced locally also increase resilience in the local food system. And I think this is another very interesting thing that we need to consider, right? So when your crops fail, you can still turn to the animal who you might eat. Some people refer to non-human animals as banks on hooves, right? Also because the animals can eat things that are more perhaps easier to grow and less specific than the crops that you grow for direct human consumption. So we must be very careful that we do not lose that resilience by the large-scale adoption of vegan diets. Okay? And there's also moral costs associated with importing fruit and vegetables, right? Imagine asking the Inuit to consume fruit and vegetables. It's a very difficult thing to ask because they would lose resilience. They would increase their dependency on regions away from the northern areas, and they would become more vulnerable to their autonomy being, further undermined by the loss of local self-sufficiency, you might call it. Right? So, having said that, I don't think we should ban the importation of all fruits and vegetables, right? But we need to be careful because there comes a point where the costs, the moral costs of importing fruit and vegetables become so significant that it might actually be less morally costly to consume locally produced or locally caught animal products. So I think we should modify the position to one of qualified moral veganism, which means that vegan diets should be the default diets for the majority of the human population, because the majority of the human population, according to my research, can sustain themselves on a nutritious diet that is not imported from a long way away, can maintain sufficient local resilience by adopting vegan diets. However, the reality is that the trend is in the other direction. So average consumption of meat alone has roughly doubled in the last 60 years. Right? And in real terms, the global production of meat has increased by more than sixfold in the same time period. And this is a graphic representation of that, where you see global meat production going up from about 70 million in 1961 to over 350 million in 2022. Right? So, in other words, qualified moral veganism requires democratic support, and at the moment largely lacks it, because the trend is exactly in the other direction. So either there's something wrong with the arguments that I've been putting forward, or the arguments are valid, but for some reason or other, we do not manage to make people act in accordance with this moral theory. So I think to build support for qualified moral veganism, those who adopt moral veganism and others must reflect carefully on their positions. So even if I've been a passionate vegan for more than 2 decades, I still question my vegan diet every day. And I think this is really important for myself. It's also important to defend my diet against others, particularly because I have about 60 first cousins. And as far as I know, none of my first cousins are vegans or even vegetarians. So you often get asked, you know, why do you adopt such a diet? Yeah, out of curiosity. And sometimes people feel that they are maybe challenged in the way that they do not adopt such diets, and they feel the need to ask you to defend your alternative position. I've been running a mailing list on animal ethics, and you can contact me about this if you want. I mean, I don't think this is necessarily a tool that will help us to reflect on our positions, but nevertheless, it's a forum where people share views about animal ethics and sort of inform people about events that are taking place, which might help us to develop some sort of a community, if you like, right? Because it can be quite lonely to be a vegan in this world, right? It's very different now from what it was 20 years ago. But even so, you don't encounter too many others who adopt that dietary or moral position. So given that many people appear unwilling to adopt vegan diets, preferring vegetarianism or carnism, right, which I think is an interesting concept coined by Melanie Joy, because many people who are carnists do not ever feel the need to defend their position. But if you refer to their position as carnistic, or you say you're a carnist, are you? They might perhaps be challenged to defend why they adopt that position. So what should be done to curtail some of the costs associated with the consumption of animal products? If people are going to be unwilling to adopt vegan diets, there are other things that we should try to do to curtail the costs that we are now associating with the consumption of many animal products, at least. So one thing that we could pin our hopes on is on the development of lab-grown meat, right? Where we just take a cell from the animal. We do not have to kill the animal. We do not have to inflict pain or suffering on the animal, right? If we take a cell carefully, at least, right? We could put the cell into a lab petri dish, provide a medium to it. At the moment, they're still using fetal bovine serum, but they're trying to find an alternative to that, a plant-based medium, to make the cell grow and multiply. And then eventually you might end up with a lot of mincemeat that you can turn into a burger or whatever it may be. And instead of having to kill an animal in order to eat meat, you could then have your cake and eat it, right? You could just cultivate it from cells. Now, of course, it's quite possible the cells might also be sentient, but they may not. The kind of sentience of a cell may not be quite on the same level as the kind of, or may not have the same moral significance as the sentience of a whole animal you might need to kill in order to produce conventional meat. There's another reason why I think we should embrace lab-grown meat, and that is, what are we going to do with the cats? Yeah, we have so many domesticated cats, and cats might be obligate carnivores. If we want to continue to feed them, rather than, you know, kill the cats, try to rewild them, or I don't know what else. If we want to keep keeping them as domesticated animals, then we need to find a way in which we can feed them whilst minimizing the harm that that feeding will impose on other animals. So that's where lab-grown meat might also be useful if it is developed sustainably, as well as in a way that minimizes concerns about impacts on animal welfare. So to conclude, universal veganism is not morally required to protect global health. However, the human consumption of animal products raises many moral questions because it frequently fails to maximize positive global health impacts. Probably should have added positive global health impacts there, right, in front of GHI. Many, but not all, should be addressed by the adoption of carefully chosen vegan diets. This is the simplistic version of the theory that I've developed in this book, which is free for you all, folks. It's free, it's open access, right? And these are the references. Thank you.
We need to open up to questions. I'm moving towards the microphone. We have a lot of people online who are watching who can't actually hear the questions from the floor. So I will be up here and I will repeat your question to Dr. Dekkers. And then at the end of the session, we will be open to questions for any of today's speakers. And again, if you don't mind, I will repeat the question so that people watching online can hear. And we also welcome questions via Zoom, which we will read out. So firstly, are there any, thank you so much.
You can call me Jan, you know?
Thank you, Jan. It's been wonderful listening to you. And are there any questions, please, for Jan?
Thank you.
Hello.
With your permission, you'll allow me to start things. And you're probably aware of this, but you were being provocative, and I'm very grateful for that. The first is, you probably know B12. A lot of the industrial agriculture, they're supplementing the cattle's diet with B12, and the much easier, sustainable option is just to spray fortified, specially formulated B12, which I've been doing for 16 years, just under the tongue, and it's so much better. Absolutely.
I do the same.
Could you summarize the question in your answer? That's probably the easiest way of doing it. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah. I'm not sure if you're debunking what I presented, but I'm saying maybe there are some people who do not have access to the same spray that I think I'm using from Boots. It's blackcurrant flavor. Yeah, I use the same one.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Or even fortified yeast, etc. And it's becoming sort of prevalent. And the other thing, I don't like the word exotic because I don't think anything in the world is now exotic. We're so sort of, well versed with territories and, countries and so much information. But this thing about indigenous, what I found, and again, I humbly ask that there's a lot that I don't know, but what I do see with indigenous communities is alongside you've got McDonald's and other things that have been set up as well. So the indigenous sometimes is an excuse that we patronize with, and I don't think that's healthy either. So I just wanted to say those two things, and just to end with, yes, cats, you're absolutely right, obligate carnivores, but you can actually supplement and create, alternative options as well. So I know you know this, but I just thought I'd put it up.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know about the last bit, whether there are good alternative non-animal sources to feed cats with.
Yeah, you can
Okay.
just supplement, as you say,
Right.
obligate carnivores, absolutely. And for my dog, 12 years thrived on a vegan diet.
Right? Thank you. But the question about patronizing exotic cultures,
I'd say indigenous.
indigenous cultures, I didn't mean to patronize the wari from Western Brazil, but I think maybe I have done that. If I did, I didn't mean to cause any offense. But I think for me, it's really interesting. In order for me to understand whether our sort of revulsion, I would say in our culture that there's a strong revulsion against cannibalism, is morally sound, I would like to explore how cannibalism is understood in different cultures. And going to a text from, I can't remember the author now, who studied the Wari, was for me interesting because she's actually talking in the article about what the Wari might have been like before, under the influence of Western missionaries. They had to change their practices because they no longer practice cannibalism now, even if many people are very reluctant to have changed their practices. Because, of course, maybe the reluctance that they might now have might have been influenced by Western ideas. So for me to try to go back to the situation of understanding this culture before they were influenced by the people who converted them, if you like, is important to try and find out whether my revulsion about eating the deer has got some sort of similarity with the revulsion that others might feel when they contemplate eating not a human being, and whether this can be generalized to eating perhaps not just the bodies of non-human animals, but also the products derived from the bodies, even the milk from non-human animals.
Thank you so much. And also highlighting cognitive dissonance. Sometimes you're not aware, but as you say, until you contemplate away from culture, indoctrination, habit, need, etc., you might come up with a different sort of. Thank you. I won't hog space.
Thank you. Can I just say, because we do have a lot of people online who simply cannot hear anything from the floor, if you have a very simple question, I will happily repeat that, or we could include the question in your answer, Dan. Or if you'd like to make. Well, the microphone is here actually. So
all right, okay.
But any more detailed observations or questions, you're very welcome to come up, please. It's just important that we include people at home because we're getting a number of comments from people saying we simply can't hear the proceedings. So, yes, hello.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was wondering if you thought about the ethics around wet nursing. It's not an area I'm very familiar with, but just compared to cannibalism, generally speaking, in cultures where there is relatively a lot of wet nursing, it tends to be more closely related people, and there's more of a kind of taboo around more distant related people. So that's kind of flipped over from cannibalism.
So the question is about wet nursing. Well, I'll leave.
Yeah. Is this a good place to stand?
This is the microphone here. So
Okay.
Anywhere around here.
Yeah. So there might be a taboo about wet nursing when the wet nursing is being provided by somebody who's more distantly related, is the question. And whether that might also connect to my idea of that's the consumption of human bodies, as well as parts of human bodies in this case, or products derived from human bodies, is associated with some sort of revulsion. Yeah. I'm not sure. I can't now say I don't actually mind being wet nursed by somebody who's distantly related from me, because I think that would probably not be perceived very well. But I've said it now. Yeah, but yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, it's interesting, for example, that not many people will be willing to go underneath a cow and suck from the teats of the cows, but we need to, yeah, extract that milk first and then consume it to create some sort of a distance. Yeah, with human babies, we do not have that, or at least, or milk could of course also be expressed and then put in a bottle before the baby consumed it. I don't know. I certainly think this revulsion is probably something that's there with the bodies, which is why I think many vegans would not want to eat the deer. Whether it also operates at the field of eating eggs, milk, cheese, I don't really know. I haven't made up my mind on it.
Could I take a question online before I come to you, John? Arvin Thomas at UCLA, could you perhaps suggest one or two effective strategies you use to persuade non-vegans, say your students in classes, to consider ethical veganism? Your discussion of cannibalism recalled Cora Diamond's point that for non-vegans, the concept of the human is predicated on the assumption that non-human animals can be eaten and humans cannot be eaten. So my second question, are there ways in which you can get non-vegans to reconsider the definition of the human, to embrace non-human animals as worthy of the same protection or care that we extend to humans?
Okay, great question. So I'm familiar with the work of Cora Diamond. Eating Meat and Eating People, I think, is the article that you might be referring to, which is actually something that started me off in thinking about cannibalism, amongst other things. And I thought that when Cora Diamond talks about the idea that we should not be eating the body of a human being, regardless of the mainstream concerns in the ethics literature, which are all about the killing and the act of killing or the infliction of pain and suffering, Cora Diamond says actually there's something else going on there. You just perceive a human being as in the category of not edible. And that made me think whether we could perhaps open that up, whether we might have a similar aversion, perhaps particularly in relation to those organisms who are closely related to us biologically. So if that's correct, then eating a mussel, as in M-U-S-C-L-E, right? Eating a mussel or a crustacean or something, an animal that's more distantly related.
The other one.
M-U-S-C-L. C-L-E.
M-U-S-S-E-L.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
Sorry. The other one.
Just so we're clear.
Yes. Okay. Yes, absolutely. M-U-S-S-E-L. Absolutely. Eating a mussel or a crustacean or an insect would be less problematic than eating an animal who is more closely related to you. Because that kind of notion that Cora Diamond has, I think, can be extrapolated, because ultimately there's no sharp line between human beings and the rest of the animal world, because we're all connected. But we are more closely connected to mammals than to insects. And that is morally significant. So a lot of animal ethicists, they make this mistake, I think, of forgetting about the interests of the human agent. They say we should treat like interests alike. But what they forget is that the human being has got a very strong, I call it evolutionist interest, to give priority to those who are evolutionarily closely related to the human species.
So I disagree with that.
Would you like to come up and do your question here? Because would that be possible?
I can do that.
As you're on the end, it's easy to get into the queue. Thank you.
So I think it's very dangerous to use revulsion as a basis for any sort of moral conclusions. Take, for example, the fact that many people have revulsions against other humans who look different from them. That could be the basis of racism.
Yeah.
That we have revulsions against eating insects, which is probably a good source of protein. It probably would be a good diet compared to eating cattle or something like that. Yeah. So I think, revulsions depend upon instincts that have been produced through our evolutionary development, but are not morally based. And I really worry about arguments, moral arguments that are predicated on revulsion.
I understand your concern because you can feel revulsion towards so many different things. The question is we need to try to separate morally significant revulsions from morally insignificant revulsions. And I think that's a difficult task. I certainly agree with that. Nevertheless, I do think that revulsion is a morally significant category because I do think that there are certain things, like, for example, the thing that Cora Diamond talks about, that are very hard to explain unless you invoke something like the idea of disgust or revulsion. Because otherwise, it's very difficult to explain what exactly would be wrong with eating a human being who has died accidentally, say, for example, whom you have not deliberately inflicted pain on, and who have not deliberately killed. As long as you can make sure it's healthy, because of course there's pathogens that might be passed on in the eating of a human being. I think unless you've got something like this idea, hold on, that's not in the edible category, and that's some deeply rooted, I think, in our biology, you're not going to get something that's morally worthwhile. And I think we can still hold on to that thought that there are certain revulsions that are morally significant. For example, we have also revulsion about inflicting pain on an animal, right?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a morally significant revulsion as well. And you wouldn't want to cast that out of the way.
I still don't think it has, I don't think it has moral significance. I mean, it is something that we experience.
Yeah.
And I've never been convinced by Cora Diamond's argument, for example.
Right.
We have to be concerned really about of course, this is a consequentialist argument.
Yeah.
But we have to be concerned about the effects of our argument on the other beings and us as well.
Yeah.
Right. But revulsions are easily overcome in most cases. Mm-hmm. So a revulsion against insects probably is fairly easy to overcome if you get a little bit of experience with it.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
I need to think more about it. I mean, this might also play itself out in the argument that's currently being debated in Parliament about physician-assisted dying, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people say, just do what's in the interests of the patient, right? Mm-hmm. Set your own feelings of moral purity as a doctor aside, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Where I would say, no, actually, we need to consider the interests of the patient. We also need to consider the interests of the doctor. And if the doctor has a certain revulsion, you might say, about giving somebody the means to kill themselves or doing the killing themselves, as in euthanasia, then I think this is something that we need to take morally into consideration.
Well, the doctor case is really interesting because many doctors initially feel a revulsion against doing surgery, but that's part of their practice. That's something they have to do. Yeah. So in this other case, that same argument is made in a medical context. Well, you shouldn't have a revulsion because it's part of your medical duty to assist dying when a patient is in need of that, when the consequences would not be there. So I'm still not convinced by the revulsion.
That's actually a good example because if you see people operating on a television, you might get a bit squeamish, right? And this is precisely what we don't want the doctor to be. We wanted to overcome that revulsion so they can actually operate in safety.
And that is standard in medical training, is learning how to overcome.
Yeah.
I know.
Thank you for your challenge. Yeah.